I hope everybody's having a good Monday. I've just been listening to a Paralympic athlete rather, talking about her journey. So I'm feeling like I can take on the whole world today, even though it's Monday. I'm going to do it. Yes. So hopefully you are feeling the same too. Good stuff. So I think we have sufficient attendees now to kick off. Others will trickle in, I'm sure, as we get going. But my job is simply to do the introductions. I'm not the important speaker here. So I'm going to start and get us going because we only have an hour and we want to get to the good stuff. So I'm Ben Lewing. I'm Assistant Director at Foundations, and I am responsible for the local development work that Foundations does. Um, and I am absolutely delighted to be introducing today's webinar, which is all about evidence use. And in particular, as you will know, having registered, we will be hearing about the learning from PEDAL's Mobilise programme, which supported policymakers to understand the evidence about early childhood development and to put it to use in their work. We have a couple of speakers that I'm going to introduce in a moment and say how they will be contributing. But I did want to share a few of my broad reflections about knowledge mobilization, evidence use. Like many of the people here today, I suspect I've been on a long journey when it comes to thinking about the most effective ways of using evidence and mobilizing knowledge. It's involved a lot of experimentation over the past couple of decades, I have to say. And there are three things in particular that I wanted to put in your minds before we kick off. And they are themes that will come through the webinar as our speakers get going. So first of all, something that has struck me repeatedly is the importance of a broad understanding of the evidence that matters when it comes to making things happen. Some of you may be familiar with the work that the Early Intervention Foundation did on creating an evidence pie, as it became known, which talked about research evidence and local evidence. But I'm increasingly distinguishing between experimental, experiential, and contextual evidence. But crucially, it's just this concept of having a broad understanding of what evidence can be and how it helps to do different things. The second thing that struck me from my experimentation is crucially that evidence use doesn't just happen by magic. Unfortunately, it takes time and structure and often needs a trusted guide as well, sometimes an independent trusted guide, but not necessarily so. You may be aware that Foundations is currently running the Changemakers program with 4 local authorities. And that program is about investing in local evidence leaders to lead evidence use systems. Essentially, it's our latest experiment. And it's being evaluated by Cordis Bright, and we'll know more about what difference it is or isn't making towards the end of this year. But thinking about the kind of structure that's necessary for good evidence use has been a key theme through the work that I've done. And then thirdly, and again, I suspect we will hear a lot more about this over the next hour, trust and relationships make the difference every time. We can ignore people's passion, their personal journeys and their networks at our peril, because things like word of mouth and experience can just be so much more compelling than an evidence review. It doesn't feel like it when you're trying to get the exact words right for a publication to get it out the door and try and influence people. But actually, it's those ideas being picked up by people who really care about them and can communicate them with passion and energy that seems to make a huge difference. And we have to make evidence use feel personal and compelling. So enough from me. We're about to hear more about the Mobilise programme, which builds on each of these in a really powerful way. But what really strikes me about Mobilise is that it has a slightly different focus to much of the work that I've done, which has been about local practice. This is very much about policymakers, which I think makes it hugely interesting because it's an often overlooked set of stakeholders. It's almost as though we expect national policymakers in particular to instinctively understand evidence and how it should be used in a sophisticated way. And maybe that's true, but let's find out. We're very fortunate to have with us today the programme creator of Mobilise, Sal Hogg, who is now Assistant Director for Programmes and Impact at the Royal Foundation for Early Childhood. And also a participant from the Mobilise programme, Sarah Lefkihi, who is a policy lead at DFE for parenting, family hubs, and Start for Life. And just before I hand over then to Sal, one final reminder, please do use the Q&A function. Get your questions in as we go, and we will pick these up towards the end once our two speakers have shared their thoughts. Sal, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to see some familiar faces in the chat today, as well as some new faces. I just wanted to start by saying a big thank you to Foundations for hosting this event. It feels like we've come full circle, because when I was scoping this programme, I got in touch with Ben and really tapped his brain on lessons about how to share and mobilise evidence. And I feel like we then went away and did our project, and we're coming back to add to this increasing body, I think, that we're all interested in, which is that how do we close this well-known gap between evidence and policy and practice? I've got some slides to share with you to talk through today, but before I do that, I thought I'd just do a little bit of introduction. So as Ben said, I am now at the Centre for Early Childhood, which is part of the Royal Foundation, but I did this project for PEDAL. So I spent 2 brilliant years as a policy fellow in PEDAL, which is the Centre for Play Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. And I had this wonderful freedom for 2 years to think about how to, well, this is sort of exam question of how do you close the gap, how do you get more evidence into policy, and Mobilise was, how I spent that time, and it's great to be able to share the learning. I'm going to share the learning of a very specific programme of work we did, but what I really hope is to get across some sort of wider principles that informed it and transferable lessons that aren't just, is this the right programme to do, yes or no, but what did we try and test and explore and learn? And in this big process of experimentation that Ben's been talking about, what did we add to our understanding of how we close that evidence to policy gap? So I'll just share my slides. I hope you can all see those. I'm using PowerPoint Live, which means you might have some functionality on your computer to be able to skip ahead in the slides. So if you want to do that, fine, go ahead. But if it ends up looking a bit odd between what you can see and what I can do, maybe just to have a look at whether you're in the right place. So key messages I want you to take away from today. I'll plant these before I even start, and then I'll come back to them at the end. That if most of us work in children's policy or practice or services or research because we care about children, what happens to them. And if we want to change the world for children, sharing evidence alone won't do that. We need to think about how we mobilise knowledge. And that means we need to be quite thoughtful in if we are thinking about sharing evidence, how we do that in order to really help to change the world we want to change. And Mobilise tried to do that. And we had some principles behind how we worked, particularly about co-production and relational approaches. And I think what we showed was that those were really important in actually mobilising knowledge in an effective way. So at PEDAL, we were a multidisciplinary research centre with lots of research about early child development, from health, education, developmental psychology. And we wanted to really make sure that the evidence that we were doing was improving children's lives. And I was given this task to think about, well, how do we make sure that evidence is really influencing and informing policy? And what I saw coming in, my background is in government and NGOs. And what I saw was this model of kind of evidence dissemination. And a lot of that was to do with quite fundamental things about how research in academia is structured and funded. But basically, there was a sort of, the academics did some wonderful research, and then at the end of everything, there was a bit of money in the funding and a bit of time just before the funding ran out to say, we're going to tell everyone what we learned. And the models were very much one of kind of disseminating and kind of sharing outwards. So we are going to do, maybe it's a policy roundtable, maybe it's a briefing paper, whatever it might be, just to tell people what we've learned. And then we're going to move on to the next thing. And a feeling of kind of dissatisfaction that people aren't acting on that, policymakers aren't using this research. And what I wanted to do was really try and change that fundamental idea of what is it we're trying to do. It's not about us as academics just sharing what we found. It's about us as part of a system thinking about how is this evidence useful and used. And therefore we need to think more about this idea of knowledge mobilisation. So organising and sharing knowledge, which may be the evidence we've created, but it might be other stuff as well, in ways that inform and drive action. And I guess that was my other reflection coming into academia, was that academia is very structured around very specific research projects and sort of exam questions that people are answering. And often a single bit of research does not hold what policymakers or system leaders, decision makers need to make the decisions they're making. Actually, we need to think about our role as curating lots of different forms of evidence. And I saw that actually academics that I worked with in Peddle were amazing at doing that when they were in teaching mode. They would pull together, you know, when they were teaching master's students or supervising PhDs, they'd be able to pull together lots of different evidence from different sources. And they had these huge brains, huge knowledge about early child development research. But then often when they sat in a room thinking about policy or place-based approaches, they were thinking about themselves as a very specific academic. I am this person who knows this specific thing, and this is what my research, my latest study has found, rather than being the much broader experts that they were. So that change of kind of mindset from evidence dissemination, from knowledge to knowledge mobilization was really important. And that means we change our starting place to say, actually, when we're even just approaching any of these tasks, we're not starting with, we've just done this piece of research, we've found something and we want to share it. We start with, what do we want to change for children in the world? What are these policymakers whose behaviour and decisions we want to influence? What are they trying to solve? What are they doing? And how can we help that? And how can we work collaboratively, bringing our research and expertise as a tool to the table that's useful? And then linked to what I just said about how can we think of ourselves in these conversations when we're researchers or academics or people who understand that evidence, not just as the evidence creators of specific bits of research, but actually as these experts who can play that role that we do more as teaching in academia, about convening expertise, curating information and catalysing learning and action, and thinking about how we help people on that learning journey of understanding evidence, not just telling them what we found. And linked to that as well is what Ben said about a broad understanding of what kind of evidence and knowledge is. And we were really interested in the sort of models that come more from sort of when evidence-based practice was first talked about in things like medicine, where it's saying, well, we've got evidence from research, but that's not just the answer. The answer is taking that and understanding the babies, children and families, communities that we're working with and what they need and what matters to them, and coming to this as experts and knowledgeable people in our own art and bringing our understanding of the culture and what we need and bringing those three things together. And that's kind of where the sweet spot lies. And so what we were doing when we were designing the Mobilise policy was thinking about, actually, academic research isn't this trump card, it's part of this puzzle. And actually what we can do is not just bring that part of the puzzle, which is really important, but also actually help to curate and convene some of those other sources of expertise as well. I wanted to be very evidence-based in my approach to sharing evidence. And that was another sort of thing that I really reflected on coming into academia, was that so much of what's done in academia that I saw was incredibly thoughtful and purposeful, from thinking about how research is designed and how it's done and things like ethics and collaboration. And then there was far less thought given to the bit at the end, the evidence dissemination. And I wanted to bring that level of thoughtfulness into evidence dissemination activities that existed everywhere else, but also for that to be in itself evidence-based. So I looked at, well, what do we know about people who've bridged this well-known, well-rehearsed gap between evidence and policy? Who's done that well? Who's managed to actually bridge that gap a little bit? And what can we learn from that? What are the problems and how can we be alert to those problems and think about actually what we're doing intentionally to solve them? But also, I guess, as Ben said, we're thinking about policymakers as human beings who we want to influence their behaviour and their knowledge. And we know a lot about how human beings work, about behaviour change, about workforce development and learning, which is very much what this was. So what can we take? What's transferable lessons from other spaces around kind of just, what does a good training programme look like? Or what does a good how do we change behaviour? What do we know from that we could bring in to design this process? And from that, we sort of pull out some very common themes. I've put a few of them on this slide. The first one we've sort of talked about a bit. Change doesn't happen just through sharing evidence. We must build trusting relationships. And I know, as policymakers, you can be bombarded with people who are sharing evidence. How do you know which evidence to listen to? How do you have those meaningful conversations? Well, you have to know who to trust and have that relationship in which you can talk about the evidence. So that relational element was really important to what we did. And I think, again, seeing it not just about us sharing research, but us playing a role in the system, we could also convene people and create other relationships which might be helpful. We know, and teaching is full of this. We know didactic interactions don't result in high quality learning and behaviour change. You don't just tell people stuff. We know that. And yet so much evidence dissemination is based on the fact you just tell people stuff and their behaviour will change. So we wanted to think about, well, how do we make it interactive and varied and create learning experiences where those light bulb moments might happen and where people can take evidence and knowledge and make it meaningful for them and the work that they're doing. We know that sharing evidence alone is not enough. And so we really wanted to make our programme action focused and really do that bit of helping the policymakers we were working with to think about how they put evidence into the action, the work that they were doing. Change rarely happens through isolated events or communications. It happens through repeated exposure to information. It happens through relationships. And yet again, often a model used in kind of evidence dissemination is, well, we'll do an event and we'll do a press release and then people will know this stuff and change. Whereas actually we need to sort of really be able to repeat things and allow interaction and iterative ways of people engaging with information and learning. So we built that into our programme. And we know that information has to be tailored to needs. We have to make things real for people. This is, when you teach anybody something in terms of workforce development, you really have to say, well, your practice needs to change in this way. This is what it needs to look like for you. And so what we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was useful for the people and tailored to the people we were working with. And we felt the best way to do that was through co-design, through actually saying, well, what is it you need? What do you need to know? You're the experts in yourselves and your needs and your knowledge. How do we co-design our approaches with the people that we want to support and work alongside? So all of that meant that we identified a set of overarching principles that inform the Mobilise programme. And these really then sat behind everything we did and enabled us to be really intentional in lots of bits of design of the programme. So co-production, I'll talk a little bit more, but basically we, not just as a single one-off event, but throughout the programme, we were constantly testing what was it that the policymakers we were working with needed to know, wanted to know, how did they want to engage, what did they like and not like, and how did we continually change what we were doing in light of that. Evidence-based is an obvious one, but that's about us sharing not only our evidence, but the wide source of evidence, but also being evidence-based in how we design the programme. The interactive element was really important. How did we think about every moment that wasn't just people sitting listening to stuff, but absorbing it and getting involved? Being relational was really important, and that went right from the first kind of contacts with people. How did we make sure that the way we were dealing with the policymakers we were dealing with felt really relational and built that relation of trust and relationship between them? So things like when we even first sent out the first joining instructions for the first event, I wrote a personal Christmas card that came out at Christmas to everybody on the programme saying, I'm really excited to join you. Those kind of touches, those moments of actually we're investing in relationships. What does that look like? Child focus was really important, and that meant two things. One, it meant that we started this by thinking about children and what do they need. We didn't come at this through a particular policy lens or a particular professional lens. We weren't talking about what should health visitors do. We weren't talking about what should public health do. We started by saying, what do we know about children and how children develop and what they need? And then what does that mean for all of us? And a particular benefit from that, when you're talking to people who come from different fields of policy, and we know policy can end up feeling quite siloed, actually the child is the common bit. We can all think about what we're doing from the child. And that sort of brings that commonality, which is important then to the sort of relational bit. The child focus bit also meant we actually built children into the programme. We made sure we spent time out in the wild with real children, because actually I think that's often so missing. We can spend our whole lives thinking and talking about children and not really understanding what life is like for them and spending time with them and showing them that they're valued. Action focused, so that was really about making sure that everything we did was thinking about how people are going to use this. And that also included things like having action learning sets and stuff throughout, so building that approach. And system-wide, really thinking about that whole system we're working with. How do we bring policymakers from across that system together, and how do we reflect the whole system in what we do? So what was the actual programme? What did we actually do? We did a semi-structured 6-month-long programme. So we brought together a cohort of policy actors, and I'll talk a bit about who they were and how we selected them. And we worked with them across 6 months to help them to use evidence from early childhood in their work. And They all had a shared interest in early childhood. They were all doing some form of policy work, which was about supporting young children and their babies, young children and their families. It was semi-structured because across the 6 months, we had this kind of broad way of working. So we started by building people's understanding of early child development, then thinking about, well, what works? What do we do to support that child development? And then thinking about, well, what is the role of policymakers in creating a system that puts that evidence into action? And how do the individual people on our programme play a role in driving change? But across that skeleton, the rest of the content was really co-designed with participants. So from the first, when people even applied to be part of the programme, we were asking them what they wanted to know. The very first day we spent together, we asked everybody to think about what were the topics they wanted to cover as part of the programme. And we did a big kind of post-it note and grouping exercise. And the whole curriculum was shaped by actually, what was it? So within understanding early child development, for example, what were the bits of child development people really wanted to learn about? What did that look like? And that then influenced the programme, but that was a continuous process. So so the agenda for each of the days we spent together was only nailed down after the previous day because we were constantly open to it changing. And we also changed how we work with people. So we learned from how day one went, and we changed the next time we were together, what the agenda looked like and the type of activities. We changed some practical stuff. So, for example, we shared with people podcasts throughout the programme, and people said, well, actually, if you share this to my work email, I don't ever listen to it. Let's have a WhatsApp group. Let's put it on people's phones, and then I can listen to it, on my dog walk, whatever. So there's practical bits as well as the fundamental, what we're doing. And we also built into bits of the programme. So throughout the programme, this idea of how do you make the kind of financial economic case for early childhood came up. And actually the group felt safe enough to say, there's some really fundamental stuff we don't understand about economics. So we built in a kind of teach and learn session with Sarah Catan, who's an amazing economist, who did a special just one-off webinar with our participants just to on that basis. So that constant actual co-production was really built in. So this is what it looked like. It was over 6 months this time last year. And the sort of main pillars of the programme were these 3 days that we had in Cambridge around those themes: understanding early child development, what works, and then making change happen. And for each of those, people arrived late afternoon. We had a bit of an introduction to session, and then we had a dinner together, and all of it was very intentional. We wanted people to get away from their work into a headspace they were able to learn. We wanted to create relationships. So these things that might feel like a bit of an indulgence, going to a Cambridge college, having dinner together, were all incredibly intentional parts of the programme, as well as the actual bit that we were teaching people. Each of those days had a mixture of academic content, getting out and about in communities, and hearing from professional experts, as well as lots of time to reflect. And there was deliberately time between them because we wanted this space where people could go away, reflect, iterate, build on their knowledge, and then come back ready to engage again. And that they were constantly putting into action and then thinking, oh, now I've taken this back to the office and talked about my colleagues, I thought there's a gap in my learning, let's address that. We had monthly action learning sets. These were small groups, so 5 or 6 people who would meet just online. They started by following a very formulaic type of action learning, where we had people brought a problem they were dealing with and other people coached through it. So some of you might be familiar about that form of action learning set. We moved away from that. It didn't really work for the group. This was our constant kind of learning, and they basically just became safe spaces where people could talk about what they were doing, how they'd understood the last bit of learning they'd got from the programme, how they were putting into action, and just tap other people's brains. And that was really important. And then every week throughout the programme, we started the week with a weekly email on a particular topic. And those topics were the things that people had told us they wanted to learn about. So they might be things like, how do we engage dads? Let's get a better understanding of poverty, those sorts of things. And for each one, we just collated some very accessible, good resources. We didn't create them. We collated them from across the sector, good policy reports or briefings or videos that people could watch to deepen their understanding. And it was very much people could dip into those as they wanted to. It wasn't that they had to read it, but they were there. And we created them on an online platform as well, very much knowing that sometimes people wouldn't read it that week, but they would know it's there and they might come back to it, or they might direct their colleagues to it if something came up that was relevant. And there was also that podcast, as I said. And then we really made ourselves available for bespoke support. So people could really tap our brains when issues came up. So as someone was having to write a ministerial briefing about a particular issue, or as a particular question came up or something hit the news and they wanted to understand it better, they could come to us and talk about those things. As I said, the big pillars of the event were these 3 accelerator days. We called them accelerator days because they were really intense. So that idea of kind of really taking people a step up in their learning. And as I said, that kind of combination of those different forms of evidence in those days was really important. Each one had some academic evidence, some time out in communities, some time with system leaders. So that might be other civil servants, that might be people from local systems, it might be professionals who could really talk about what they were doing. So for example, on the first day, we had some academic, more sort of lecture style, some sort of teaching, but very like small group about academic development, about cognitive, social and emotional development in young children. And then the group went out to a nursery and spent a couple of hours with 2-year-olds, really sort of seeing that and bringing that to life. We made everything very interactive. So, for example, when the system leaders came, we had really expert people from charities and health visiting and others. They didn't just present to the group. They actually just had time sitting with small groups, really answering the questions people had and reflecting together. And that time and space to connect and reflect was really important. And actually, as the programme went on, people asked for more and more of that. We thought we built time in for people to digest and reflect on what learning meant, but actually they wanted more and more. So we did things like, you listen to a talk from someone, you have a good discussion about it, and then you go out in pairs and you walk around the gardens of the Cambridge College and you really think about what that means. And that was really valuable. Time is a huge thing you can give people. The group, we decided on 15 policymakers and local leaders. And the size of 15 was intentional because it felt big enough to be varied and worthwhile, but small enough that you could really be relational. And a lot of the things we then broke that group into smaller groups for things like the action learning sets. Those people came from a mix of national government across the 4 nations of the UK. And we also had some local leaders. So we had a charity leader, a head teacher from a nursery, and somebody from a local authority as well, bringing in that kind of whole systems view. UK government departments selected their participants, and that was because we needed to know before we started that those government departments were brought in and we were going to get a core set of people. But for everyone else, we ran a competitive process where we really sought out people who wanted to be involved in this. And we said you had to have an interest in early childhood, but you could come from any bit of the system. So we had people from health, public health, family hubs, supporting families programs. So lots of different bits of the system, but all interested in families and early childhood. And when we were recruiting, we were looking particularly for what we called change makers rather than particular roles or levels of seniority. So we wanted people who wanted to be there, who themselves and their colleagues thought would really actually want to get involved in the knowledge and mobilise it. And when we were looking for change makers, we defined that in 2 ways: a set of internal capacities around your interest in this area, your commitment to it, your ability to be someone who is kind of persistent and going to actually be quite tenacious and put the evidence into use. And also an external set of change makers. Were you in a job where you were well placed to put the evidence into use, and did you have the support of your colleagues to do that? And those 2 things are important. And were you actually at the point in a policy cycle where evidence could be used? Because actually when you're making policy decisions or advising ministers on decisions, that's probably more when you can mobilise evidence than if you're running a business as usual programme. And an important bit was that right at the start, when we ran that process, line managers had to get involved in endorsing people's applications and had to say that they would definitely protect people's time to be involved in the programme, which was really important, and protecting things like travel budgets, because actually we found as the programme went on, people were really having to fight for their ability to stay involved, and the fact that their line managers kind of signed up to it was really important. So we conducted a mixed methods evaluation to try and learn what worked and what didn't work. So we collected qualitative and quantitative information at various points throughout the process, both formally and informally. So we both collected kind of feedback forms from people throughout the process, and that formed part of our evaluation. And not only just from the people involved in the project, but also from their line managers and colleagues back in the office, because that those were the people we thought could tell us whether this was really creating some change. But we also had a lot of informal data collection. So we did just keep our own notes, our own reflections as a team, the kind of emails people sent us with feedback or the WhatsApp messages, those form part of our learning as well. All of that was pulled together into the research report, which you can find online, and we'll make sure you get the link to that. And that pulls out both learning about the kind of process and how it worked, but also importantly, the impact. And we used a COM-B model to think about impact. We knew we wouldn't be able in the timescale we had to know whether we really had to change things for children out across the UK. But what we did was have a clear theory of change and think about, well, if we can build policymakers capacity, opportunity and motivation, and if we can see some influences on their decisions and their action and how they advise ministers and how they support policymaking, then we can suggest we're having the interim impact we would like to have in order to change things for children. So we use that model throughout. And the other thing about the evaluation is we knew we didn't know what the future of this programme would be. You know, I was only there on a 2-year fellowship. The kind of the next step was not always clear, and we really clear that what we wanted to do was to create a model that could be replicated and grow in future, but also to just find some transferable learning that anybody working in this space might find useful. And so the report really tries to bring that out. So we found that all of the things that we designed into how the programme worked seemed to work well. There were things that could have been better, but actually the structure and the way of how we designed the programme, as you can see if you're reading this slide, all seem to work, that mix of both types of activities and types of content. In terms of improvement in people's capabilities, we saw a range of kind of improvements in people's knowledge, confidence, and also ability to drive change. So actually what people talked about was sometimes they knew the evidence already, but what we helped them to do was have a confidence in repeating it to other people, making the case, talking to people, either talking to ministers or talking to Treasury colleagues or senior colleagues in the department, and collating that evidence and presenting it in a way that made a difference. So we saw improvements in people's knowledge, but we also saw improvements in their confidence in using and seeking evidence from different forms and in using that evidence in that discussion. And then the other type of capability we saw was actually that we'd strengthen people's relationships and networks, both between the cohort, who were then able to call on each other more, but also between the cohort and other people in academia and local systems. So it wasn't just that they got useful input while they were in the room with us, they had a better confidence network and knowledge that they could keep drawing from in the future if they wanted to pull on and understand issues better. So some quotes here that really bring that to life. I'll move on because I'm conscious that I want to give us lots of time for discussion, but when you get the deck, you can read these quotes in more detail, but they speak to those different types of building a capability. Motivation in the group was already, so if you think about the COM-B model, we've got capability, opportunity, motivation. Motivation in this group was already high. We'd sort of selected people who were already really keen to use evidence, but it improved further through the programme. And I think recognising that working in government policy or in local systems is hard, particularly at the moment. There's lots of change, there's lots of challenge. People find, to keep motivation up is important and is useful for people. And people talked about kind of reigniting their passion and being reinvigorated as a result of the programme, and having that kind of going back more likely to kind of push further, to break down some barriers, to really try and make change happen. We really wanted to make sure that we weren't just working with 15 people, but we were working with 50 people on behalf of the teams and departments they represented, and that they could go away and share learning and drive change, and that was a really intentional part of how the programme was designed. So we did things like, for example, when we shared the weekly emails and podcasts, that was done so in a way that people could forward things onto their team. We did little kind of summaries of learning throughout, which people could share with colleagues. And we really help people to think about, actually, how are you going to share this learning? How are you going to help others in your department to benefit from this? And we saw that in the evaluation, that participants were saying they were doing those things, but colleagues, line managers themselves are saying, yes, I learned more as a result of my colleague being on this programme. I learned about these things. They presented it back to us. It was really useful for us as a team. We saw impacts on decisions that policymakers were making, or the advice they were giving to ministers, who were obviously the ultimate decision makers in a lot of government policy. We saw changes in how they went out and sought information, and we also saw facilitated and joint working across departments. So there were real examples of specific things people did as a result of the programme, which showed it being put into use. And that came through a set of anecdotal evidence that people were telling to us about, actually, when I wrote this briefing, the government changed while we were doing this process. When I wrote this briefing for new ministers, I presented it differently as a result of the Mobilise programme. I brought it into our conversations. And we did see participants on the programme really thinking, particularly around that change in government, how do we, as people in the Department for Health, Department for Communities, Department for Education, collectively brief our ministers in a way that's useful more than the sum of its parts. I think an important bit was we gave people a lot of evidence and new learning as part of the programme, but we also changed their behaviour in a way that enabled that to continue. So they didn't just learn what they learned on the programme, but they were actually more motivated and more able to seek evidence from different sources beyond just what we contain in the programme. And people talked about doing that as a result of being in the programme, but particularly about using evidence from different sources. So this idea of actually seeking impact from professionals, seeking impact from children, and using that as evidence to inform policy really was a real change we saw in people as a result of the programme. And the bit about kind of coordinating and learning from others. And because we had people from the 4 nations of the UK, that facilitated some really useful learning, because actually the early childhood systems are different in different parts of the UK. People don't necessarily always understand that. They're really curious about what they can learn from others who've done it differently. And also people that they can talk to and get it, because actually they work in a policy-making space, they understand it, they can have honest, safe conversations, but they are doing things a bit differently. So that bit of collaboration was a really important change that came about from the programme. I loved this quote that we got from one of our participations, which is participants in the programme, which is that the programme is going to prove to be impactful in ways that can be tricky to measure but can't be underestimated. And I think that's what we really felt. It's really hard to say what really changed for children in the UK as a result of a programme like this. We didn't do an evaluation that allowed us to pick that up, and I'm not sure we ever could really. You know, we're changing bits of behaviour and understanding of some people in very complex systems, with lots of other factors changing that. But I do think we really did help to improve policymakers' competencies and understanding in ways that will be valuable for them, not just in the work they were doing while they did the Mobilise programme, but hopefully with sustained impacts. Will we ever know exactly what changed? No, I don't think so. But I think we've got a very clear theory of change. Again, you can read this in more detail. I don't expect you to see this on the slide, but about how we think the changes we did see in our group could lead to better policy for children in the UK. So we've got a clear theory of change. And I think what we've done through the evaluation is show that this makes sense and that the first stages of it are true. And we hope that the following stages are true as well. So just to finish, I just wanted to go back to those values that we talked about, those 7 values that underpin the programme, and say actually what Mobilise did was show that those really were important in how we made change happen. So there's some quotes on these slides that really bring to life that actually, you know, co-producing the project, the programme and the curriculum with people was a really important part of making it useful and therefore used. That the relational element of it made it really valued to people and created a lot more learning and sustained change and support for people beyond just what we delivered. And again, all of those other parts of the programme really seemed to be part of what made it work and made it valuable to the policymakers that we worked with. So I'm going to stop there and just finish with those key messages that I started with, that sharing evidence alone won't change the world, but we can be thoughtful about how we mobilise knowledge and really see our audiences, policymakers, professionals in local systems as people, and be thoughtful about how we work with them and how we help them choose evidence in the work that they do. And I think there's some very useful lessons from Mobilise that I hope people can take and tailor for whatever work you're doing in this space. So I will stop there and hand back
Sal,
to
that's fabulous. Thank you so much. Very clear and really powerful. If you haven't seen the formative evaluation report yet, please do take a look, and it can give you the fuller detail. And obviously, we will share the slides. But of course, you have the benefit today of asking questions to both of our speakers. So please do pop your questions in the Q&A part of Teams. We have a few questions there already, but please do add some more, and we will come to those in a moment. But now I would like to pass over to one of the participants of the Mobilise programme. Sarah, welcome. How did it feel for you?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here. Goodness, I can't praise this program enough. I thoroughly enjoyed it from start to finish. It's funny that Sal, and I had not seen her slides, but as she was talking and using the word curate, as I was really reflecting on, well, why was this so different to kind of other, training programs or other CPD that I've been on? I'm a civil servant, as many of you, I think, probably are as well. And, training can be variable, but I have actually been on some fantastic, really intensive courses before. But this was next level. And I was really like, okay, what's the difference? Pick it apart. This to me, I would compare it to, going to, an exhibition. You're a kind of an enthusiastic non-expert. You're standing in front of, a painting, thinking, that's great. And you're trying to sort of, you walk around the exhibition and you're sort of, you've got no guide, but you're trying to kind of, piece it together with what little you know about maybe history of art and the kind of, the political context at the time. Think about that as your, as on one side, and then think about, I like, the kind of these new sort of immersive experiences that that kind of galleries put on now. This was, this was, the podcasts, the kind of the WhatsApp group, the weekly, emails, and the action learning sets really, kind of made this, an immersive experience. And it was, when you were being kind of guided through this by a whole host of expert guides and, curated by the inimitable Sal, who, kind of was the the curator in chief of all of this. So I think that's the difference, the chance to kind of really genuinely co-create. I think a lot of times people talk about co-creation in all sorts of different contexts, but I've hats off to Sal and the team, because I don't know how you managed to kind of make everything so genuinely like a collaborative approach with each of the 15 of us, to give so much of your time, that kind of bespoke support. The impact of that just on my kind of policy making alone has been enormous. The ability to kind of just call upon Sal when, I'm getting pressure from a kind of, our comms team to put a certain messaging out in a kind of comms campaign. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's quite right, but I can't quite articulate that, but I've got the whole, I've got the backing of Sal and a kind of an academic team to help me articulate that in a way that really had, that impact in the moment. I was a kind of a sort of self-confessed academic paper junkie, beforehand. I love, 70 pages, yeah, bring it on. But it would never, this has made me really interact with evidence in such a different way. Like I would never have, and it seems really silly now, but the names at the top of the page would just literally names at the top of the page. It would never have occurred to me to kind of reach out to, and sometimes I've, beforehand we've been thinking, God, this is great, but I need this, or I need like, what is this, I need more of the backstory, or, and now I think not just have I got lots of contacts for whom I could, kind of, sort of reach out, not just the cohort, but the kind of, people at Pedal have been incredibly generous with their time. I've been put, not just at Cambridge either, I've been kind of put in touch with people at, at numerous different institutions. And that builds a relationship where now I have the confidence, and now my team also have the confidence, because you don't just do it for yourself. You kind of, the people on my team and within my division, I think, if I'd said the words executive function one more time to them and tried to kind of, really get across my newfound passion for this kind of element of, of early childhood development, but being able to kind of go and actually not just sort of, in that didactic way, kind of tell them that it's really important. I was able to kind of bring it to life through kind of sharing so many of the experiences, being told about, having the sort of, as we said, kind of academic style session where it was like, this is what executive function is, as just one example, and then going in the afternoon and getting down on the floor with toddlers and seeing, oh yeah, look, they really, that kind of managing of the frustrations and how this practitioner is really skillfully kind of scaffolding their, just enough support, not too much. Like it was kind of, it was, to say it was impactful was is probably an understatement. But look, I want to leave time for questions, and I'm more than happy. I could talk for a long time, but I won't. Safe to say, I think, if this were replicable, and it could run again, I mean, I miss it. I would just keep doing it.
Sarah, thank you for sharing your experience. I see you in a completely new light now, I have to say. 70 pages of academic papers, bring it on. Well, why not? I'm not going to say more myself at this point, because I do want to get us to questions. I did just want to reflect on one very quick thing, though. This idea that spending time with children is going into the wild is so prevalent when you become an adult, isn't it? When does that actually happen? It's ridiculous, isn't it? But it really resonated with me, Sal. Okay, let's get to the Q&A now. And I'm going to go back to the first question from Kathy, which really tries to dig into what the learnings for academics have been from this programme. Sal, you talked about it being a sharing, a connection between the two. How did this programme influence how academics see the world?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Kathy. It's a great question. And there is a section in the report that, because we did an evaluation too with the pedal team. I didn't get to talk about that today, but finding out from them what they felt about it. And I think, it was a relational programme, and that works both ways, right? So when we have the dinners where the pedal team and the participants come together, everybody's tapping everyone else's brains. And so actually that bit where the academics can say, oh, that's how you see what I do, or that's the problem you're trying to solve, right? Well, maybe our next research should move slightly in this way, because then we can be useful to you. So I think that, again, kind of people just understanding the wider system more and making the relationships that either inform big decisions or just a kind of brains to tap for small bits of information is really important. I think one of the things, and this sort of touches on a question that someone else has asked as well, that was hard for the academics, is just that academics are so time poor. And so I obviously had the huge luxury of having dedicated time for this programme. But what we really had to do was to make sure that actually this wasn't about me, it was about me connecting the policymakers and the academics. And it was hard at times for academics to find the space to engage, even when we brought people to Cambridge and they were around. And so I think that's where, Mobilise was great, but it also raises issues about structural problems that make this hard. And actually some of those need addressing as well. I think it speaks to the value of having multidisciplinary teams in academia, not expecting academics to do everything, but having policy experts and knowledge Mobilise experts as part of teams. But you also need to make sure that academics have the time to do that meaningful engagement as well.
And Sarah, from your perspective, how did that feel, that relationship between the two?
I think kind of as the programme was progressing sort of in real time, I think it was so intense. I don't think that we really, as policymakers, I think we were probably a bit selfish, and we were just kind of like, this is amazing. Like, how can we just soak up as much of this as we possibly can? It's great, I think, to hear. And when we saw the report come out, I think that, that it was more of a two-way street, I think is great. One little example I can share, and it's kind of, it came about, I think, actually as part of, so I met Dr. Louise Dalton from the Oxford Brain Story, I think actually at one of the sort of conferences where we did the kind of, our sort of closing, kind of piece. And it just was kind of, I think, the ability then to sort of think across the system and to kind of have that confidence to think, hang on, I can help kind of disseminate for this, you know, this kind of academic thing that's brilliant. I have access to, you know, through the Family Hubs programme to lots of local authorities who could benefit, or lots of parents who could benefit. Making those links and sort of having, I guess, the confidence to just go up and say, hi, I think we could help each other here. And then, you know, carrying on a relationship, taking that through, you know, that we're now, you know, I think it's those sorts of things where it might not be, you know, kind of necessarily a kind of a direct result of the programme, but it's that sort of difference in sort of our ability to kind of, you know, use evidence, articulate, and to kind of, and to sort of capitalise on the, you know, on the kind of the networks that we have as, you know, policymakers, as well as those kind of academic contacts as well.
And I'm really struck by the way that unprogrammed time was built into the programme. So dinners are often the thing that gets lost first, but they're incredible for building relationships and understanding and making people more open to ideas. And you talked about having sufficient time for reflection. Again, I've been a participant or a leader of many programs where it feels like you're just trying to squeeze too much in and there isn't time to really let it sink in. So it felt like that was a powerful part of the program.
Yeah, and I was quite manipulative in some of that, Ben, because I thought about, it was always presented as a day, because everyone can take a day out, that doesn't feel too much, but it was a day that went from 3 p.m. to 3 p.m. So it was actually 2 days, but anyway, it's just 24 hours. And what we did, and so there was a bit of content. So people weren't just coming for dinner, because if they'd just been coming for dinner, they probably wouldn't have come. They'd have come the next morning. They were coming for a little bit of content, the 3 to 5 p.m. slot. So they had to come because otherwise they'd miss content. And then they had the dinner. And so that, you know, really actually anticipating that bit of that busy people always do, or that their line managers might ask them to do, and sort of protecting against that quite intentionally was important.
Yeah.
It was very clever and it worked extremely well.
Okay, back to the Q&A then. There's a couple of questions from Eliza here, and I wonder whether the fuller report will help with these. The first is on particular publications or texts that you would recommend for insights on mobilising knowledge, and the second for who else does knowledge mobilisation well. So when you were constructing the programme and thinking about the evidence underpinning knowledge mobilisation, who did you turn to? What did you draw on?
Well, you, Ben, of course, the work that Intervention Foundation. I think the Intervention Foundation had done a good journey of kind of thinking about starting with just talking about evidence-based programs, then realizing people can't put evidence-based programs into practice just by knowing about them, and therefore what do you need to do in local systems. So that I don't think there's anyone that's nailed this, but I think there's lots of people who've nailed bits of it. And so, and I also, as I said, people don't always talk about it in the same way. So for academics, it's evidence dissemination, or it's kind of sharing their research, but other people are helping system leaders go on different journeys in different ways, helping them to be better policymakers. So I sort of really opened how I thought about this, which is why I brought in stuff about actually just teaching and learning, because there's a process there of helping human beings get information and use it, which is important. So I looked at just people who'd got good workforce programs. As anybody working in the early childhood sector would know, like Harvard always do things well, and they've done some interesting programs in South America and Brazil around kind of systems and helping people to use evidence. So there are some people doing it well in the early childhood space, but I think it's more about learning about what bits people have learned along their journeys, what they wish they could do that they haven't done, and then sort of amalgamating all that together.
Okay. Some questions from Thomas here. The first, did you work with policymakers to improve their research or academic literacy, given that academic papers are never perfect and riddled with bias and methodological issues? So was the focus on research literacy? And then his second question is about the future of programs like this. Should it be a rolling program, and so on?
Yeah, good questions, Tom. I think we did a little bit, but probably is not as much as we could have done on academic literacy. It's one of those things, you know, when you start developing the programme, you just end up with a curriculum that is 3 weeks long, and then you think about how you do bring it back down. I think what we tried to do was just to build that into everything we talked about. Sarah can tell me whether or not this felt like that, but I think, you know, so when our academics were talking about early child development, there was a lot of kind of, it's not as easy as it looks, it's often interdependent. How do you actually, what are the flaws people often have when they're thinking about these things, and how do we point people about avoiding those flaws? We did do something about what are the kind of pros and cons of different types of experimental approaches. For example, what do RCTs tell us? What don't they tell us? How can you be a bit more thoughtful about what evidence means? So we did a bit of it, but we could have definitely done more. And I think also that is about the relational bit, actually. How do you get people to be able to just talk through academics about what they know and what they don't know, so you're not just reading papers and trying to make sense of them? And what's the future of this or similar programs? When I was designing this, I had this dream that we could kind of keep repeating Mobilise and build this huge kind of alumni cohort who were changing the world. And that would be amazing. Sadly, some of the changes that happened in Cambridge and in Peddle around kind of changes in funding and infrastructure meant that wasn't immediately possible. But I think it's something that the Peddle team is still thinking about and what could be done. And what I hope we've done is to share the learning that others could pick this up. This isn't a program that's licensed as IP. I'd rather that there were lots of people doing similar things in their own way on the issues that they're working with. And I have done quite a lot to talk to early years funders and others to get them thinking about actually what should they be funding in this space, and that funding just a piece of research and then a roundtable is not the way to change the world. And you also asked, Tom, in your question about the role for elected politicians. And we did actually scope up and have a funding bid in, but sadly it was unsuccessful around the election of taking a cohort of new MPs and doing a Mobilise programme with them. I think that would be really good fun and really interesting. So I'd love someone, maybe it's me in the future, maybe it's the Peddle team in the future, or maybe it's all of you going out and doing all of these things. I think there's definitely a future for things like this. And there are some creative funders out there. A big barrier to that is kind of whose job it is. And I think until academic institutions think more broadly about what staff makeup and funding makeup they have, that isn't just about doing research, but is really about taking knowledge mobilisation seriously. I think the ability for universities to do this stuff is quite limited. Some are much better than others. And that's where kind of partner organisations like foundations and others may play that really important role.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, I don't know whether you want to briefly comment on research and academic literacy. Did it feel like it was helping you with that?
I feel like it felt very embedded. It felt very kind of, there was sort of certain kind of explicit parts, but it felt more, as I think Sarah was intending, that it was kind of, more embedded through the, sort of through the program, which worked for me. I mean, I can't speak for others, but yeah, that it certainly worked.
Okay, and we have a final couple of questions. One from Julie on how AI might be able to help with curating evidence, which is interesting given the emphasis on relational approaches, but clearly there could be a powerful role for AI in making sure we are thinking about the breadth of different sorts of evidence that we can bring to bear, I guess. And Catherine is asking about which parts of this other academics can replicate if they haven't got significant funding. So a key question for all of us.
That last one first, that's where we tried to draw out the principles of the approach, because I hope the principles are something that you can think, well, if I'm doing anything in this space, even if I'm just designing one activity, how do I move? If I've got a tiny bit of budget and a tiny bit of time, how do I move from being alongside people and helping them from just telling them? Like, how do I just take that mindset shift into what I do? So I hope that the report and those principles are useful. And the report does have a section, if you're an academic, what could you take from this? So I hope that's useful in that sense. And happy to talk to people in more detail about that. The AI thing, I think, is interesting because, as you said, Ben, there was a big relational element of this programme, but we did also show that people, do need things very bite-sized. AI can potentially, for those who don't have this, like the 70-page report, don't have time to read it, could AI pull out key messages? What I hope we did in this was help people think about the questions that they're asked or they're asking of the evidence. So maybe make more intelligent use of AI. One of the things, for example, I think is I was really keen in this programme that we really help people understand early child development, because I think if we look at traditional evidence in this space, the sort of RCTs of programmes, unless you understand what outcomes you're trying to change for children, and how they map onto other things in that child's life. How do you understand whether an RCT actually whether it was measuring anything that was helpful and relevant to your course? So I think you have to understand fundamental things about how children develop, which outcomes matter in early childhood. You have to be able to ask the right questions of the evidence as well as use it and understand what it's telling you. And so perhaps programs like this if you're then on AI, you at least ask it the right questions and you know what questions to ask of it and what it might be telling you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, it's now 1 o'clock, so we have reached the end of the webinar. I hope you have enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. Sal, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your insights and learning. We really look forward to seeing what this next experimentation will be that uses the extensive learning that's come from this program. I have to say, I'm really keen that we end up in a place which feels like we're building on what we've learned and not constantly losing and restarting. And I hope we can reach that place soon. But it's a fantastic program. Please read the evaluation report and keep talking about Mobilise. Thanks very much for attending today, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.